Good morning. I'm Chris Reykdal, Superintendent of Public Schools for the state of Washington. Thank you for being a part of our press conference here. Every 2 years, I submit a biennial budget request to our governor and our legislature. This is what this is about today, is really framing what is possible in Washington from a very hopeful, forward-looking vision of fully funded basic ed and well beyond that. So I first want to just say thank you to everyone out in our school districts and our communities, to parents especially and students. We're off to a great school year, several weeks into it. Things look very, very good. There's a lot of hope and optimism and excitement out there, but we can do better than that even with the right investments, and that's what today is all about. Public education is the cornerstone of our democracy, and when I say that, sometimes people wonder a little bit about that. And the reason I say that is, in our state, for example, over 1 million students are engaged in public school. It's this great democratic opportunity to make sure that young people get access to public ed from age 5 all the way to age 18, and sometimes all the way up to age 22 if they need it. And it's socialized across the society. We collectively invest in this to give opportunity, and that's what's empowered us to create young people who want to be engineers and designers and business owners and public servants and teachers and nurses and doctors and all the stuff that we need in our world. So I never want to lose fact of the point that in our state, the paramount duty is public ed because of the economic opportunity it provides and the empowerment of individuals. So that's what this budget's really about today, and I'm super happy to have folks tune in. 5 years ago, our Washington Supreme Court, after holding our legislature accountable to fully fund basic ed, said, you've gotten there enough. They told our legislature they'll keep watching, and they insisted in their court determination that it wasn't about getting to some place and being done, but a persistent examination of our budgets, a constant re-examination of what's needed to fully fund basic education. And I think what's happened since the pandemic, high inflation, impacts to budgets, a reliance on one-time federal money, and a lack of investment on the state side consistent with inflation has got us once again in some serious constitutional risk. This budget aims to address that. We'll go through the details of those components and how we're trying to go beyond basic education to build the system that will be successful and enduring in a time of transformation over the next 20 years or longer. I always had concerns that special education wasn't amply funded, and we'll get into that today. But I also know that our districts are working very hard to continue to maintain services for students with disabilities under their federal and state requirements. But it's time to get this job done for our students and to ultimately make the commitment of equity and opportunity for all of our kids. Let's contextualize where we are today. Here we were in 2019. Going into a pandemic that nobody knew. Our legislature had made significant investments in our public schools. I follow this particular measure that I've been reporting on consistently for the last 8 years. I look at a national data group who asks the question, how much is each state investing of its economy back into its public schools? They add up local investments, so our levies, and our state investments. They do that because some states rely almost exclusively on state money like us, and other states rely very heavily on local school levies. So to make it an equal analysis, they add local and state together. Washington State has always lagged behind. After that McCleary ruling, the state legislature made key investments for 3 years. We still didn't close the gap, but we got within 0.2% of GDP. And once again, we've slipped now, and we're roughly 0.5% behind. The data lags a couple years, but we're very confident that it's actually gotten worse over the last 3 years as the state has collected lots of revenue due to the high cost of goods and services, but investing a much smaller share of that into public schools. At a 0.5% difference in GDP, 3.1% in Washington versus 3.6% nationally, that's $4 billion per year. $4 billion per year that we would have to invest in our schools, either from state investments or local levies, just to get to the national average. It's a good goal for Washington to have. We are a high-performing state academically, above the average by a lot, and in some cases in the top 10 or 15. But we can't be the best unless we invest like we're the best. And so it's an important context for our state to constantly be reminded of is no matter how much we talk about investment and all the expenditures that I'll propose today and all the partnerships we create, it isn't sustainable unless we have a tax policy that is sustainable. And Washington fails on that consistently year in and year out. Let's talk a little bit about some other ways to contextualize this. We were over 50% of the state budget at our peak in 2019. That's down to about 43 or 44%. It's another way to look at how much K-12 has slipped. I do want to caution everybody, there is no constitutional requirement to be 50% of the budget. And in fact, in Washington State's history, when we have booming economic times and the legislature collects extra money, they can go do some other priorities, and Washington's K-12 system tends to slip a little. During recessions where K-12 is mostly protected and other things have to get cut, K-12 share tends to go up. So it isn't a hard, fast rule, but when you combine the fact that we're $4 billion behind our national average peers and that we've been declining as a share of the state budget, I think it's time for all of us in a bipartisan way across the state and every community to recommit to schools in our state. The other, I think, alarming thing for me is recognition that our state sought a waiver to the federal government last year. The federal government has a couple of requirements that maintain, that expect the state to maintain a certain level of investment. Our state fell $600 million short of that in the last cycle. Our executive office, not my agency, but others sought a waiver and got it. I suspect they're going to have to seek a waiver again. I will not support that. I want to be super clear. When the federal government says you have a maintenance of equity effort or even a maintenance of effort where you have to maintain K-12 as a share of the budget, we ought to do that. It's federal law and it's a good moral obligation to our students. So I do ask that our lawmakers not seek that again and instead meet it through investment and not seek the waiver again. You're hearing about closing schools, you're hearing about budget cuts. There's ample time, I think, in the Q&A to talk about multiple variables. At a minimum, of course, inflation has been devastating to our schools to the tune of $1 billion. No doubt that enrollment declines are a part of it. Those are two-part realities. One is a declining birth rate. We just have fewer 5-year-olds in the state than we have 18-year-olds. So as we graduate more kids, and we replace them 13 years earlier with new 5-year-olds coming to kindergarten, they're just smaller cohorts, and that means less revenue for school districts. The other part of enrollment decline, though, is though we've stabilized and are growing slightly, the pandemic challenged many families to think differently. And several of them in the early grades, for example, chose homeschool options, which are perfectly great options. This agency works hard to partner with the homeschool community to get them access to materials, but often they don't want to do that for a long duration. And in fact, we've been watching our numbers climb in each grade level over time as families say, I wanted to do this during the pandemic, I wasn't sure about the health measures. They have high confidence and they continue to return their students. In fact, we passed 95% of our school levies last year, which tells us that our communities really love and cherish their public schools, but they are growing frustrated by the cuts, and that is what the budget here ultimately aims to address. So let's get into it a little bit more deeply. We have 3 significant items in our budget request this cycle. 2 of the 3 I've asked for consistently and made progress on, but we unfortunately find ourselves asking for a whole lot more. It's special education, it's transportation, and something called maintenance, supplies, and operating costs. You're going to hear MSOC a lot, everyone, in the next 6 months, maybe the next year. Think about this as the basic things districts have to pay for. Their insurance, supplies, just the real bread and butter stuff of running a school system. Like all of us and our families, insurance has been really escalating. Our districts face the same thing, and when they don't have the resources to amply pay for those, they have to cut programs, sometimes impacting students, or they have to rely on their local levies. And that means they're not doing the extra things that you wanted to do as you voted for levies. They're just surviving, and that's what we find ourselves in. So the biggest 3 chunks of our budget that address the constitutional obligation of the legislature, special education, transportation, and this MSOC categories, maintenance and supplies. Let's talk about special education for a second here. It's been a significant amount of progress, and I do honestly challenge everybody to thank a legislator, incumbents in particular, over the last several years. They've taken our special education budget in the state from $1.1 billion a year to $2.2 billion over the last 7 years. That has been essential just to fill up the bucket of obligation that the court demands, and that IDEA, this powerful federal law that empowers young children and their families to create a civil right expectation of support for their students with disabilities. That number has been moving a lot. Again, we've doubled it. It is unfortunate that the federal government makes a 40% promise and provides less than 20% of the money. So my office, in parallel to working with the legislature, often pushes our federal delegation to think about that as a number one priority going forward. Special education first and foremost, and we'd love to see all kids get meals, which is also a federal obligation in many ways. Let's get into some details about this. Our special education ask, of course, continues to try to remove the cap. There's a funding cap on special education. I do always want to be clear, districts will still serve all students, but it means they are not guaranteed money on the front end. They have to go on the back end of those processes and hope that they get what's called the safety net reimbursement. We should minimize that significantly. Our state should make a commitment on the front end to every student based on their individualized learning needs, and our state should fully fund that. They are down significantly right now to the tune of $700 million. This budget asked for $300 million in the first year, jumping to $700 million by the second year to fully fund special education. It increases what we basically think about as the financial obligation for those individualized supports. It removes the cap, as I said, and it enhances something we call inclusionary practices, continuing to invest in systems and supports for students, but also general educators, so that students with disabilities continue to get more and more of their instructional time with their peers in a general education setting. Our state has made fantastic progress on this, but we have to keep going with the resources in training educators and supporting families and supporting students. And of course, there's been an important federal case settled in the last year that is going to challenge our state to go from supporting students with disabilities when they need additional services through age 21. It jumps now to age 22. There's an additional year of eligibility for some students based on their needs. I said very publicly we would not challenge that case because I think it's the right thing to do. It will cost some additional resources. Our budget request fully considers the compensatory costs of doing that, making sure that we have the resources, and then going forward, making sure those students get support. Transportation is that second large category. We're focused on what we call special passenger populations. These are students with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, students in the foster care system. We have highly mobile populations, and our data is really clear. Those are the students most at risk of getting behind in school, ultimately getting behind in credits in high school, and are much more likely to drop out. We have our dropout rate down to the lowest level we've ever seen, but to make progress on that last 10 or 11% of students, it's going to be very, very critical for us to invest in the things that make a difference, getting them to school, feeding them, making sure that they have supports. So transportation becomes our second biggest priority. It's $152 million in the first biennium. It's $204 million in the second biennium of our request. You're going to hear me talk about that a lot in the conversation and in the future, because our legislature has to balance the budget over 4 years, not just 2. So we want to be very transparent about the 4-year cost of all of these things. Now that maintenance, supply, and operating cost, MSOC, again, stick it in your brain. It's the latest acronym you'll hear about. These are important things: insurance costs, other mandatory needs for schools. Liability insurance has jumped significantly by 50%. Utility costs are up by 30%. The total cost here of supplies has increased on average about 30% just over the last couple years. Our request asks the legislature to take that entire category up 9.5% and maintain it at that level and then inflate it. So it's not a one-time payment and then it goes back down. We're seeking a permanent 9.5% increase to MSOC. These will be enormous opportunities for districts. I mentioned some things are up 30 and 50% in categories. There are other things only up 3 or 5%, but this 9.5% addresses across that average what is necessary. I'm very proud to put in this budget requirement. Well, the requirement's already there by the legislature. It's one of several things that were passed as policy but weren't funded. And that's menstrual hygiene products in our schools. Our schools have an obligation to make sure those products are available for individuals who need it. It didn't come with money. This budget includes that as an example of one of those basic constitutional obligations within our funding formula. So we would anticipate the legislature to take as much opportunity with these investments to go back through their statutes and figure out all the places they've added obligation and didn't fully fund. Those would be the primary targets that would avoid future litigation. Our MSOC proposal, maintenance and supplies, is $350 million over the first 2 years and $410 million in the second biennium of this process. As I said before, we have to go beyond basic. This is the hardest thing I explain to people around the state. I get to travel thousands of miles, talk with students and parents and business leaders and school leaders. And so many people say school should do this and it should do that. And I have to say to them, well, there are laws and constitutional frameworks that say what the legislature must do. And so much of what we do in our public schools is beyond basic. It's beyond what the court told the legislature they must do. But it doesn't mean we ought not do those things. They are often the difference in student achievement. They're the difference in families feeling like they have choices and options within their schools. So I want to talk about a category of investments that are beyond those constitutional obligations. So not the big three, special ed, transportation, MSOC, but things that go beyond that we think make a fantastic school system. And I think a lot of these items you're going to resonate with, and you're going to say to yourself, why aren't those basic ed? We'll talk about student mental health. It's an essential function now that never was thought about for the first 120 years of our statehood, and in the last decade or so, we think very differently about it. Educators want us to push on this as a basic ed right, and in many cases, these programs aren't yet, but we want to make the case as long as we're making the comprehensive case for school funding. So mental health and behavioral health are enormous priorities here. If we're going to maintain our academic recovery, which has been very robust in math, it's been good in reading, but we slipped again this year. You can see the strain of the system's finances. It's taking its toll. I am never satisfied with our student academic performance until I see every student has growth and all of our data points are going higher. We've seen great growth again, but we are challenged here and we've got to work hard at it. We'll talk about dual credit, this idea that students get college credit while they're in high school. And then there's an emerging opportunity here to focus on attendance, behavior, and credits. So the pandemic has been impactful on attendance. It's been impactful on behavior, but this was building before. And of course, anytime you go through something like this, there are students who can fall behind on their credits, particularly in high school, and our budget request addresses that. Let's talk mental health very specifically. We took on this issue during the pandemic. I had very little discretion over federal money, but this office at OSPI made a decision with some of the limited discretionary money we had to build regional mental health systems. We rely on 9 amazing partners called the Educational Service Districts. They're really the hubs of the work. Think about this as response systems. In some places, school districts have enough resource or they have physical access to it. And in other places, especially in rural communities, they're not funded well for this work, nor do they necessarily have immediate access. They're very rural, they're very remote. These ESDs collect opportunities of resources and generally do some of their own hiring, and then they can deploy them into these communities. Some of this is even tele-mental health, so digital access for students. The strategies are locally determined, but the need has never been more powerful. We will ask the legislature to fully fund that regional system. We're going to ask the legislature to invest more in social workers. They become a really important linchpin of connecting services in the community, connecting families and student needs with the resources at schools. And I would just say to everybody, you cannot rely on federal dollars that are always intended to go away as a permanent solution. I think that's part of the challenge here is we were asked for several years to just rely on our federal money and maybe the state money would follow us later. Well, the time is now. Actually, the time was 2 years ago. I submitted an equally comprehensive budget 2 years ago and got some progress here, but we're very resolute about this now because there is no federal money to rely on the way that we saw over the last several years. To that end, I want to thank school districts once again, especially school boards around the state. You are in the state that is the #1 state in America for the efficiency of our federal spending. We will exhaust our dollars on time, within a 0.5% probably. Other states are scrambling to get extensions for their money. We did not do that. Our districts deployed effectively and efficiently, and they had to use a lot of those federal dollars to backfill a lack of state funding. So thank you, school districts. You did a heck of a job on this. I'm very proud of the work that we've done, and just got kudos this morning from the U.S. Department of Education saying Washington is right there as the best state in the drawdown of federal money on time within the allowable purposes, so that is fantastic. There's a recommendation from the Children, Youth, and Behavioral Health Work Group and the state auditor. So the work group was created by the legislature. They are looking for a single entity to coordinate mental health services in our state. So even as we create regional models for support, and even as we try to drive more dollars into individual school districts, there is a need to coordinate all of this work. We have lots of layers of this work between county governments, nonprofits, state organizations. It has to be coordinated. We don't presuppose where that lands. In fact, it's probably best to land it in a place under the governor where there's a expectation of having some authority over cabinet agencies, because so much of this involves cabinet agencies, not just the separately elected officer at OSPI. But our budget request considers that and pushes the envelope on this to say to the legislature, you've asked for this work, the work group has come together, it's time to fund a coordinated statewide model on student mental health. The opportunity here is significant. If we can add social workers, as I mentioned, we'll address 1,800 schools with that work. Actually, we'll get to all schools. I just think it's important to think about the fact that this request also asks for significantly more investments in the prototypical model, which people aren't always excited to talk about, but our state does make an expectation that based on the size of your school, you get certain resources, and the social worker numbers are pretty sad, to be honest with you. It takes way too many students to generate a social worker. For example, 7,200 middle schoolers to generate one social worker. We're going to have to make progress on this. This total package is $52 million over the next 2 years and $56 million in the following biennium. Targeted supports for high poverty schools. We have a system called Learning Assistance Program in our state. This is an amazing program. Folks have worked very hard for years in the legislature to add additional dollars. These are dollars that follow students and target high poverty communities. It's a bit of a binary challenge, as we say. If you're over 50% students free and reduced or high poverty, there's a pot of money that you get resource from. But if you're just under that number, even though you have a lot of students that you need to serve, you get none of the high poverty assistance money. Our approach here is to change that. Right now, students who qualify get 1.1 hours of additional instruction per student per week. So these dollars create additional opportunity for reading supports or mathematical supports or other ways to help students accelerate academically. Again, it's very binary. Our goal here is to change the model so that if you're at 50% threshold of high poverty or more, you'll actually move from 1.1 hours a week to 1.34 hours a week. Over the course of a school year, that's a significant addition of hours of direct reading and math support in particular, but beyond that. And those who are below the 50%, instead of getting nothing, our proposal is to give you about 2/3 of an hour, so 35 to 45 minutes of intentional work every week with students who are experiencing financial distress. That's a very important thing. Let me just keep it simple for you. We have districts out there that are large, for example. They're below the 50%, but they represent a lot of students in need, and today out of this bucket they're getting nothing. This would drive tens of millions of dollars to those districts and really focus on high poverty communities. The proposal is $277 million in the first biennium, $324 million in the second biennium. It would cover 1,100 schools, ultimately more than 1,200 schools. This is perhaps the most aggressive investment the state has made in this proposal into high poverty districts. It doesn't quite double the current program, but it's significantly, it's significant in its investment. It's more than 60% increase by the second biennium in this program. Third part of this is retaining talented educators. You've read a lot about teacher turnover around the country. Our state has fared much better given the critical investments we've made in teacher compensation and benefits and job security. But now that's a little bit at risk, not just because of budget cuts, but we have observed a significant decline across the country and in our state of the number of students who go to traditional colleges and universities to become teachers. Perhaps it's the climate, perhaps it's the manufactured rage against schools and the attacks on teachers that we see. I think there are safety issues that have some young people considering that. They certainly worry about pay and stability. And we think we need to change that. We have this amazing group of people in our state, paraeducators, along with others that work in our schools, but our paraeducators have already made a professional commitment to working with students every single day. They are the best opportunity we have to grow our teacher ranks, our certificated teachers, because these are folks already in classrooms. Many of them have bachelor's degrees already, and it's about giving them an opportunity to then get teacher credentials. Teaching is more than just knowing a subject and standing in front of kids. It's child development. It's understanding behavior modification strategies. It's about student engagement. You have to learn how to assess student learning so that it's impactful for growth, not just a test score. These are things you learn in a teacher prep program. So to all of our colleges and universities, thank you for the work you do. Keep recruiting students, but we intend to invest directly from the state, as we have over the last several years, to grow our own, to find our paraeducators and those who really want to commit to the profession long term, take them from a paraeducator role to a certificated teacher, pay for their training. Our districts are paying their compensation. We want the state to match their benefits. And then ultimately through an apprenticeship model, which we have become one of the first states in the country to do, our new developing teachers in this model will get apprenticeship skills. They'll get a mentor teacher, they'll get coaching and guidance, and they're going to get on-the-job support like you would if you were an electrician or a plumber or a machinist in an apprenticeship program. So it's a very exciting model. Our state's good at this. It's time to take it to public education, and I cannot thank our labor partners, our management partners, and our legislature to date. But we have a lot of work to do here, because in special education in particular, we have a lot of need. So the first cohorts have focused on this. That's where we will grow the next several cohorts. The proposal is 4 cohorts of apprentices beginning in the 26 fiscal year, going to 6 cohorts in 27, 8 cohorts in 28, and 10 cohorts in 29. So you're starting to talk about 100, 120, 140, 160 new teachers in special education every year, which is very exciting. The proposal costs $19 million over the next 2 years. It's $33 million in the second biennium. It will grow from there with the success we're already seeing. Our classified school employees, this is paraeducators, but also food and nutrition employees, health and safety workers. Think about these as the day-to-day folks that just make schools run, that are not necessarily in classrooms teaching content areas. I sometimes reflect on my own kids' experience, and some of the people that were most impactful to them were paraeducators, a custodian of epic, legendary proportion in one of their elementary schools. It's a culture and a community of support that has to occur everywhere, but the turnover is really high. These folks are often limited to only 1,000 or 1,200 working hours a year at some of the lowest wages. Our proposal is to expand on the growth that we pushed forward last year to help these folks to get their compensation up, but to give districts choices. Increase compensation or hire more if that's where the need is. We see too much turnover in these, and we can solve that. I especially want to reach out to those of you who have students with disabilities. You know darn well by living it that so many of your contact hours with your child are with paraeducators for those additional supports. And when they're turning over 20, 25% a year, we see big turnover every 3 to 5 years. You know that your child isn't getting the continuity of support and relationship building. We'd like to get that number back down to where it was a decade ago, more like 8 to 12% a year in turnover. We think compensation has a lot to do with that. It's $695 million in the first 2 years. It's $1.6 billion in the following 2 years. That is extremely ambitious, and we should do it. We should do what it takes in order to keep the most talented people in our schools. And right now, that is a growing number of part-time employees getting low wages with high turnover, even though we ask them to do some of the most complicated work in our schools. So to all of our paras, all of our classified employees, thank you for being with us. We're going to continue to try to deliver supports for you. We also have to remove barriers to learning. I've been very proud in my prior work as the fiscal officer in the community technical college system to help build and grow Running Start, but also to get it funded by the state. The next phase of this is to get the legislature to buy out all of the fees that are directly charged to families. It's pretty powerful that we say to so many of our young people, by the time you're a high school sophomore, junior, or senior, start taking college credits. The state will pay for the instructional costs. You will save money down the road and save time getting your degree. It's a very important way that we're building our workforce in this state and getting more kids access. It's disheartening, though, when students walk up to that promise and then they get a $400 or $500 or $600 bill for all of the fees. They say, I thought this was supposed to be paid for, only to learn that the state only pays for the direct instruction. It continues to drive a disparity between low-income youth and families with resources. That happens to correlate with more students of color getting less access, and it's unacceptable. Last year, with an incredible partnership in higher education, our office, the legislature, and community-based organizations, we got rid of all the fees in college and the high school. So these are students taking college-level courses in their high school. It's time to get rid of them in Running Start. When students go to a community college, technical college, or university campus that offers Running Start, they should have the promise of it being paid for as if they were high school students, because we would never charge them in the high school for their books. Or lab fees or tech fees, and we ought not do that in our colleges either. But it does mean our institutions need resources. Our proposal is to ensure that they get all the dollars that they need. I think this is a very, very powerful thing, and I hope folks are excited about it the way we are. I continue to believe the fastest way to create transcription to college and therefore grow our baccalaureate production, our AA production, and other degrees. The proposal, incidentally, goes beyond that. It's not just for that. It's also industry-recognized credentials. We have a lot of students who don't get a lot of credit, but there's a lot of students getting a little credit as they try to pursue industry-recognized credentials. Many of these do not require a bachelor's degree or an academic associate's degree, but they require something that industry recognizes. Think about the driver of a truck. The transportation logistics system has lots of certifications students need. If you're going to work in the growing industry that we have in this state of advanced manufacturing, if you want to work in warehouses, we all know that this is becoming a state with a lot of warehouses that's housing products. But if you want to drive a forklift or operate heavy equipment, you need a certification. And we want our students to get those while they're in high school. This approach also buys out the fees for students in those spaces as well. Finally, school district fiscal health on this area here. We just know there are districts in distress. We've talked about this before. There are 5 or 6 school districts in what we call binding conditions. Those districts are working hard to get their budgets in balance. It is requiring additional oversight by us, and quite candidly, it is consuming us. Our office is spending unprecedented amounts of time and energy in this. We want to make sure that we are resourced properly to support districts. We also want to be able to deploy resources in the regions, because those districts often get most of their technical assistance, especially in the accounting world, from their local educational service district, and we want to make sure those partners are addressed as well. So we have another category. There's a constitutional bucket, transportation, special education, and MSOC. I just talked about what would move our state into the 21st century and really have us compete with the Massachusetts of the world, who also spend, by the way, $4,000 more per student. The last category is that we know for years the legislature keeps getting asked, and we get asked, can you send money directly out of the schools to community-based organizations and partners? Sometimes they have the expertise and the connections to create student impact that schools aren't trained to do, they don't have the background in, or there's a unique relationship that only the CBO can provide. Rather than letting this be random, we have collected all those this year, we have put them in a comprehensive list, and we will ask the legislature to think about this list of community-based organizations and partners. Just to throw some quick data at you, in the case of Stand for Children, one of our partners, we've seen a 6.7% increase in students on track to graduate because they get intensive support in their 9th grade year. We know from research, if you pass all your classes in 9th grade, you have a much higher probability of graduating on time. With the College Success Foundation, we see that 63% of students who participate with that organization enroll in higher ed at that level, and they tend to be from low-income families. So this group of students who sometimes are intimidated by financial aid practices and the idea of going to a traditional institution, College Success moves the needle. You know we partnered with Dolly Parton's Imagination Library. We've now distributed over 1 million books to students birth to 5. We've seen record kindergarten readiness results, and that's only a part of it, but 92% of families participating say that their student is building literacy skills and ready for kindergarten, so it's been an enormous success. 25,000 young people participating through the Boys and Girls Clubs and more mental health activities. A huge shout out to Boys and Girls Clubs. They are more than places your kids go to before or after school. They're places where additional learning occurs, some fun and some play, some engagement. They have seen the need to create a small group and peer mentorship in mental health. They've leaned into the space, and we ought to support them. 1,800 educators receiving training at the Holocaust Education and Genocide Awareness. This is the Holocaust Center for Humanities in Seattle. It's an amazing organization that talks about more than just the Holocaust. It is about genocide everywhere. Grants to this organization have helped them reach out to school districts, bring students into their facility, but also reach out in multiple modalities. There is no more powerful moment in our history than teaching students about our authentic history and the impacts of us not learning our history and the risk of us repeating it again. There is no question in my mind that anti-Semitism is on the rise in this state. We address it in several ways through guidance to districts, but we also need formal instructional training on the history of the Holocaust and other genocides in this state in order for students to have that heightened sensitivity that they're living in a time when that can happen, and we ought to lean into it. With our Microsoft partner, 625,000 students have now gotten industry-recognized credentials through exams and other means. Most of you in organizations, when you need help with technology, you find somebody who's a millennial or a Gen Z because they have access in their brains to contemporary technology skills. For lots of students, that's come from formal training. We actually teach them and train them, whether it's Microsoft Office tools, whether it's cybersecurity things, whether it's coding in Minecraft, a very, very powerful tool. We are always innovating, and this is a great partnership. And finally, I would just remind everyone that if we could get every child to learn a whole lot more outdoors, not just the biology, not just the natural resource environments, not just all of the benefits, but just being outdoors and out of classrooms, we'd be better off. 70,000 students are now participating in outdoor learning, and again, that's part of our request here. $93 million for these partners in the first 2 years, $102 million in the second biennium of our time period here. In short, I want to close the $4 billion gap. I don't accept no as an answer, and I don't accept people who say that's too much money, we can't do it. My answer is we'll do it. It's just a matter of how long will that take, and will it be in time to really change the equity equation of our state? The consequences could not be greater. We will not forever be able to import our talent. We need to grow our own in this state. $4 billion is perhaps just a fractional share of additional GDP, 0.5% of additional GDP. It's an awfully large amount in our budget. So our legislature, as they always do, will have to work hard on prioritizing K-12, think about it as a trade-off to other things that they might want to do, and I hope they will think about the revenue question as well. We have a big contemplation in front of us this year on the ballot. I encourage everyone to do your own research and vote your own conscience on those. But there's a revenue question or 2 or 3 or 4 already on the ballot. And it's important that people think about that and then think beyond that on what we could do to change from a state that taxes its lowest income consumers or families at 3 and 4 times the rate of our wealthiest. This is the reason we have perpetual budget challenges. And I think it's time to introduce this question of revenue as a daily conversation in our politics and in our budget considerations. I need $4 billion to get schools to the national average. I need $4 billion to get us to Massachusetts levels. I need more than $4 billion to get us to 50%. That's not what we're asking for here. We're asking for less than that, sensitive to the fact that the legislature doesn't have that all at once. And even with what we're requesting, $2.9 billion in the first biennium, $4.9 billion in the second biennium, that's going to be a challenge. And I recognize that. I am grateful always to our lawmakers from both sides of the aisle. It is a brutal time to serve. But you do it because you know you can have impact, and the consequences could not be greater than they are today. We're going to take some questions. I'm grateful for your time. Katie Payne will monitor questions, and we will get those answered for folks. And we have all of these resources available, including an item-by-item spreadsheet available for all the press.
Good morning, Drew Nicholson from K-12 News.
Good morning.
So $4 billion, where does that come from? Will we be asking for a revenue increase somewhere? The latest projections don't have that much money in the surplus account.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. You know, as the constitutional officer, my job is to submit a budget. The state law doesn't say revenue, but I've never shied away from that. In prior budget requests, I offered up capital gains before it became the law. As a legislator, I offered up tax on profits instead of gross receipts for businesses to help small businesses. I'll be there for every conversation of revenue. I do think we need to change the equation in Washington State, decrease our dependence on property taxes and sales tax, and increase our concept of drawing dollars out of those who have the most. That can come in the form of capital gains, that can come in the form of income, a profit. You could even make progressive sales taxes, ironically, if you offer enough credits for low-income families. So I'll be in the discussion. I also don't want to leave out something that Danny Westneat at the Seattle Times pointed out. Most people don't follow this, but the Rockefeller Institute out of New York checks every year on how many states are donors and takers. And Washingtonians, you should be relentless in your pursuit of lawmakers at the federal level who get us our money back. Right now, we are subsidizing other states to the tune of $22 billion a year. Think about that in a state like ours without an income tax, for example. We send $22 billion more out in federal income taxes. We don't get to deduct anything anymore, hardly, from our federal taxes. And as a result, our schools are short $4 billion, social services are short, everybody's short. And in the meantime, we are subsidizing programs all over the South because they won't raise their own state taxes because they keep going to Washington, D.C. and getting more money. And it's coming from Washington and California and Massachusetts and New York primarily. So this is about asking our legislature to prioritize K-12, number one. Number two, look for new revenue in our state, which I will support. And number three, getting our federal delegation to change federal funding formulas that either return more of our state dollars or federal tax dollars back to us, or start giving us the deductions that we need once again in our state so that we can then backfill. If we get multi-billion-dollar tax deductions like we used to out of the feds, that's taxing capacity for our state that ultimately means no net tax increase for our voters. We got hammered by the Trump tax changes years ago, and I expect Washington to fight back harder.
Just to follow up, you mentioned income a couple times there. Would you support an income tax to fix this problem?
I have always supported that, provided that the voters get a chance, and they always would because we have constitutional limits on that. It's considered property right now under the law, so I've always supported that if the voters get a choice, and I've always supported if it will lower sales tax and property taxes. So that's the kind of conversation we have to have. Here we are 130 plus years into statehood, and we have a system that's generating less revenue despite being a wealthy state compared to the nation, and we have to get creative. So there are limits to my support, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't be in the whole conversation.
Next question is from Sammy West with KUOW.
I'm just wondering, is there any chance that some of these school funding could come to prevent school closures here in Seattle or across the state that are kind of in this similar boat? You know, districts across the state are grappling with major financial concerns, as you talked about earlier. And I know OSPI has been helping districts keep it.
Sammy, I think I got your question. There was a bit of an echo in here, but I think it's whether or not this budget will impact or directly help address the Seattle budget situation. I'm looking at my team. Is that what they heard? So let me try to answer, and if we don't get it, Sammy, please follow up here. Our budget request, just for the core constitutional ones of transportation, special ed, and MSOC, if fully funded by the second year, would address more than half of Seattle's current budget deficit. This is a really important time to talk about Seattle. They are only 5% of our enrollments, but they're like 90% of the media attention, and I understand that. But that district has been faced with enormous challenges, and it's time for us to remember our history. Not only were we more amply funding schools 5 or 6 years ago, but before McCleary, a community like that was allowed to take their budgets and multiply it by 30% factor to figure out how much levy they could collect. The state only funds a typical model of 400 kids in an elementary school. And as you know, in Seattle, they have a lot of schools under 400. That's a choice the community made for decades. They wanted specialized schools in arts or sciences. They wanted to be able to create options for kids, whether they're language schools or not. They're wonderful things. The state doesn't fund that. The district did that for years in partnership with the community through local levies, having that additional capacity. Olympia forcibly reduced that after McCleary. They forcibly reduced levies below that, And now not only does Seattle suffer from the inflation impacts and some loss of enrollment, which they're going to have to deal with on their own, but they also don't have the ability to solve their own problem the same way. And I think all of these become a factor. Levy changes are not a part of this. This is a budget of expenditures as required by law, but I don't doubt that the legislature will be thinking about ways to enhance resources for all of our schools, including what we've offered. And I hope they will consider what it means when they only provide basic ed, and some communities want to go beyond that. If you want smaller schools, if you want additional programming, if you want to do things above basic, you have to do it with levy. And today, when districts are using levy on the basics like special ed and transportation, they can't even use their current levy money for those things, let alone the opportunity to do more. So I think this budget offers the greatest opportunity to alleviate stress in the Seattle School District and to keep schools from closing, at least not all of them. But there may be bigger policy considerations for the legislature along the way.
That's the last question from folks on Zoom.
I want to thank our interpreters here today. This is a really awesome service, and I'm grateful to all of those folks who have put this together. Thank you. On our website will be available all of the spreadsheets and the details. We know our job is to constantly push the envelope of what's possible because our paramount duty is basic ed, it's our kids. And we know we're a state that consistently undertaxes relative to the nation. And we know we are a state donating $22 billion a year of our money to other states. And I think if we are committed to our students in all of the ways we can address that, prioritizing K-12, generating state revenue, and asking the feds to constantly re-examine formulas to send more of our money back to us, then we will make our basic ed system the paramount duty and the excellence that it deserves. Stay tuned. We've got a long ways to go in the process. Just so everyone knows, I submit a budget, which we have done to OFM. The governor, Governor Inslee in this case, will propose his own budget the second or third week of December. The legislature will come to town for a session in January. If you want to advocate, I would encourage you to get a hold of your local lawmakers. Always be respectful. Always be focused on solutions. But let's get after it. Our kids need us. Thanks, everyone.